Hello, my name is Joshua J.J. Johnson, Student Resource Specialist 2 for the Veterans Academic Resource Center at the University of Central Florida, and current chair for the National Academic Advising Association's Advising Veterans, Military, and Family Members Advising Community. I will be serving today as your moderator for the event Exploring Student Veterans' Perception of Their Strengths and How to Harness Them in Higher Education. Our panelists today are Dr. Katie Sullivan and Dr. Kay Yoon from the Department of Communications at the University of Colorado Springs. This web event is a joint event between the Association of Continuing Education, ACHE, and the National Academic Advising Association, NACADA. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Amy Johnson, President of ACHE, and Dr. Charlie Nutt, Executive Director of NACADA. Dr. Johnson?
Hello, welcome. On behalf of the members of the Association for Continuing Higher Education, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. If you don't know us, ACHE is a dynamic network of diverse professionals who are dedicated to promoting excellence in continuing higher education and to sharing their expertise and experience with one another. ACHE is also the home organization for the Journal for Continuing Higher Education, where the study we're exploring today is published. As the wife of a soldier who earned his degree while at home and while deployed, I'm particularly thankful to the work of Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Yoon. ACHE members have a long history of working with and serving veteran students. And on behalf of our membership, I'd like to welcome you to this important session, highlighting the strengths of service members and veterans who bring so much rich diversity to our institutions. Charlie?
Thank you so much, Amy. And it's such a great pleasure, Amy, to co-host this with ACHE. And it's a great honor. And so we look forward to future events to have this. I'm Charlie Nutt. I'm an Executive Director of NACADA, the Global Community of Academic Advising. And just want to welcome you all here. This is such an important topic. As we know, I taught at a community college, which had a huge population of veterans in Southeast Georgia for many years, and the work that all our advisors do, as well as the folks in continuing to do with our veterans, is so very, very important. And it also makes such a difference for our campuses. I think one of the things that we don't always bring to light is the diversity that veterans bring to our campuses that are so important. And I think many times we don't always think of it that way. And we're just very honored to think of the ethnicity, the cultural differences they bring forward as we go forward. So thank you so much, Katie and Kay. We're so honored to have you with us. And I'll turn it back over to JJ.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Nutt, for your warm and energizing welcome and introduction. Again, to echo the comments that you guys mentioned beforehand, this is such an important time to present this with this webinar. And unfortunately for me, it's very personal. As many of you guys are aware, I am Air Force brat, so I'm very interested to see the presentation that we have going on today. So just as a reminder before we get started, during the presentation, again, please place all your questions down in the question and answer section. And as your moderator, at the end of this presentation, I will ask these questions during the question and answer session. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass it on to our panelists, Dr. Katie Sullivan and Dr. Katie Yoon. Doctors?
Thank you so much, JJ, and thank you everyone for being here today and listening to our presentation. Kay and I are thrilled to be here. In particular, we'd like to thank Walter Pearson, the editor at the Journal of Continuing Higher Education, for his support of our work and for making all of these wonderful connections for us. I wanted to start by just talking about how this research came to be. Kay and I have not served in the military, so a good question for us to start with, or perhaps that you'd be curious about, is how did we stumble upon this research? Kay and I work at UCCS, which is a military-friendly institution, and we have about 20% student veteran population. We think our university does a wonderful job supporting our student veterans. And one of the things that they do for new faculty is put on a new faculty orientation that includes a panel of student veterans who are talking to faculty about what it's like to be a student vet, the kind of support that student veterans need, and the kind of challenges that they face. Kay and I went through our new employee orientation together, and so sat through this panel. And one of the things that struck us was that this panel of student veterans, about 5 people, were really remarkable. They introduced themselves and talked about the places they had traveled, the goals that they were pursuing, the multiple degrees that they were getting. But the purpose in talking to faculty, as it was explained to us in this faculty orientation, was specifically to tell faculty about the challenges facing student veterans. And Kay will talk about how this manifests in the literature, but some of the things that we heard from our student veterans were about traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, some of the challenges in switching from a military culture to a university culture. And this was most of what the presentation to faculty entailed. As we listened to this, Kay and I were struck that we weren't hearing more about the student veterans' strengths because they were really a remarkable group of people. And we were curious enough after the fact to kind of dig into the literature. And what we found in the literature was what we noticed as a primary deficit framing around student veterans. And again, Kay will go touch upon this in our review of literature, but essentially in the literature, student veterans were primarily discussed as a group that may be either emotionally or physically bereft from military service. And this took up a predominant amount of the conversation, enough so that we saw it as one of the more common framings. Now, we want to make very clear that talking about the challenges that student veterans might face or the ways in which universities can support them is essential. This is an important conversation. But when we looked at both our experience as new faculty encountering student veterans and how the predominant literature frames student veterans, we saw a problem with this dominant narrative. It struck us as unbalanced and something that we wanted to remedy. And some of the problems that could come from this unbalance were that we didn't have a good understanding of student veterans' strengths from the military. And that left universities unaware of how to incorporate strengths into their discussions and support of student veterans. And finally, it could create a disconnect between student veterans and faculty and staff in the very university cultures that they are trying to be included within. Another thing that struck us as communication scholars was that communication is world making, or at least this is the perspective that we come from our discipline. And so it was really important to us to try and look at the discourses around student veterans, the communication around student veterans, and notice how they might shape the world. So from our discipline, communication as world making means that communication has real material effects. And this can be important when we look at the ways in which we talk about groups and how it can impact the way in which they're included in communities or organizations or systems, such as universities. So with these things in mind, our 2 research questions that we wanted to make very student-centered and very strength-centered, were what are student veterans' perceptions of the strength they bring to a university setting, and how do student veterans' perceptions of their strength impact their self-efficacy and motivation around academic performances. So this was our empirical exploration, and I'll turn it over to Kay to talk about the literature that we reviewed.
Thanks, Katie. Before we started designing our empirical explorations of the research questions, we wanted to make sure that we have a full understanding about what our current literature tells about the research on student veterans in general. So as Katie mentioned earlier in the introduction, the current literature on student veterans are predominantly framed as a deficit model. And it is evident by looking at 2 threads that are obvious in the current literature review. So the first thread is that a lot of research, both theoretical, conceptual, and empirical research address the types of challenges that student veterans experience. So mental, physical health, PTSD or brain injury related or mental well-being related issues are addressed. And also another really important type of challenge that student veterans experience is the lack of social connection, or the challenging in developing and building social connection on campus, being able to relate to other peer students, veterans or non-veterans, and also being able to relate to other members of the campus, including the faculty and staff members. And the third type of challenge that student veterans experience is the identity management and negotiation. The fact that they're transitioning from the military life to civilian, let alone student life on campus. They go through a lot of struggles in terms of how they find their placement in the society and how they need to position themselves in relationship with others. So they often have to negotiate their roles or their identities depending on the context and situations. Given the types of challenges that student veterans experience, the second thread of the research addresses what kinds of supports they need to be able to cope with those challenges, both at the institutional and also faculty and staff levels. So the literature points to the importance of cultivating veteran-friendly culture, and that is embodied by a variety of different things, including bolstering student services, such as building veteran student center in universities, and also offering variety of priority and privileges for student veterans, particularly in terms of enrollment and registrations and other academic related procedures. And then also building supports for faculty relationship development between student veterans and faculty and staff. And then also some literature points to the significance of the training and development of training and research for faculty and staff, for the faculty and staff development. So given this literature that we found out, we noticed a few things. First of all, as Katie framed it in the introduction, as you can see, based on the two dominant threads of the research, the current research, the framing is obviously grounded on deficit model. That's a kind of a narrative that is often used to describe and address student veteran population in higher education. Also, there is very limited empirical research involving a large sample size. So there's only a few empirical research that particularly looked at the strengths or the benefits that students were able to gain from their military experiences. But those few empirical studies were based on small number of participants or based on a case study in one particular class setting or one particular context. So we decided to explore empirically in our research project, looking at the strengths that students perceive themselves based on their military experiences and exposure to military experiences. And also we wanted to adopt mixed research methods, including both survey method and interview method, collecting qualitative and quantitative data to explore our research questions. So the purpose of the interview study directly addresses the first research question that Katie mentioned, developing deeper understanding about the perceptions of student veterans, their own strengths coming from the military experiences. And then the purpose of the survey study was to directly address the second research question, which looks at the relationship between the military experiences and the strengths gained from the military experiences and their academic performances. So I would like to share with you the result of the survey study first. So the survey study was conducted inviting the participants from our university, given the fact that we have large percentage of student population with military experiences. And we recruited participants through the support of this Veteran Student Center on our campus. The advertisement of this study participation was distributed for both survey and interview studies, and participants were able to study either survey or interview study or both. For the survey study, we had 97 participants in total, and we asked a variety of questions, mostly quantitative based data, asking their answers regard to a variety of questions about their areas of perceived strengths. And also we used pre-existing scales that measure self-efficacy and academic motivation. So as I said earlier, the key purpose of the survey study was to measure and test the impact of the perceived strengths that student veterans experienced, and how that affects their perception of academic performance on campus. So we generated a few survey items that measure different areas of strengths that student veterans perceive themselves. This was based on just a few empirical studies that have looked at student veterans' strengths in the past, and there was no pre-existing scale for this. And we conducted the measurement and validity test for this, and it came out positive. So we identified 3 areas of perceived strengths when we developed the measurements. And first one was commitment/discipline. This refers to the idea that student veterans developed their skills and cultivated their abilities through the military experiences to be able to stay motivated and discipline themselves and stay committed to the goals that they set out for themselves. And then the worldview refers to the idea that the military experiences expose them to a variety of culturally and nationally diverse environments, and their understanding about the world is more well-rounded, dynamic, and nuanced. And then the third area of perceived strengths is the connection to others, and military experiences allowed them to develop more skills and more advanced skills in working with others and leading others in teams. So based on these 3 areas of strengths, we conducted the multi-regressional analysis to look at the impact of these strengths on academic performances. The statistical results showed that these perceived strengths had collectively positive impact on self-efficacy and academic motivation in our participants. And particularly the commitment, discipline, and worldview, those 2 areas of strength had stronger positive predicting power for academic motivation, whereas connection to others had a stronger positive impact on self-efficacy. So the overall result of the survey indicates that the students perceived the strength that they identified as an asset gained from their military experiences made positive impact on their academic performances. Now I'm going to turn it over to Katie to learn about the results of the survey study.
Thank you, Kay. I conducted the interviews with student vets. I interviewed 18 participants from all branches of the military, and this chart just gives you a breakdown of the branch of service, years at university, years of service, and their major. We had interviews that lasted on average approximately 45 minutes, but with many going over an hour. And I will say it was just a tremendous privilege to be able to speak with the student veterans about their experiences, particularly about their strengths, and having this strengths-based conversation was really illuminating. There was an average of 12.5 years of service and 1.2 years at university, and the interview transcripts yielded over 200 pages of text. So there was a lot of data to work with about student veterans' perceptions of their strength. In the interviews, I asked them about the skills that they developed in the military, how they transferred those skills from military to university, their perceptions of university cultures and inroads into using their strengths, on campus. And also, because we are communication scholars, we were particularly interested in student veterans' perceptions of communication and communication strengths, and thought that this could be a contribution to the literature. The interview findings around student veteran strengths mirrored a lot of the findings in our survey. Overall, student veterans believed that they had strengths in communication, diversity, drive, and leadership. And I'll go over all of these briefly, but communication was the strongest theme around findings. And for many of you, this cartoon is going to make a lot of sense, because when I asked student veterans what a military style of communication was, just as a starting point, it all came down to bluff, bottom line up front thinking, and student veterans thought that this was a real asset. They thought that it allowed them to communicate effectively, to listen for important facts and details, to put important things up front, to give and receive communication in a way that had a positive impact on the goal at hand. And that was something that they brought into the university setting as well as very important to them and as an asset. But going a little bit deeper, one of the biggest strengths that student veterans talked about was their ability to contextualize communication. Now, often this was linked to bottom line upfront speaking, being able to understand if the context that they were in required intense communication because it's mission critical, or if it is about something that is coming up that they need to catalog or think about but don't need to respond to right now. Contextualizing communication in the military meant understanding hierarchy and how to communicate across channels, across hierarchies, with peers. Contextualizing communication also meant a great deal of inclusion. So being able to understand when you were in a community setting and you could communicate as a way to engage and connect with others. But one of the things that student veterans talked about was the ability to transfer this contextualizing communication from the military into the university as an asset. Student vets believed that their communication skills meant that they were flexible, they were adaptable, and they were sensitive to hierarchy and context in a way that allowed them to be formal when required and informal when it wasn't required. For example, one student veteran told me that he was very used to very formal communication, particularly with superiors, and that when he first got to university, he used to communicate with his professors in a very formal manner until he was invited not to. And then he was able to shift that communication and understand that the faculty member wanted him to just share ideas, to communicate freely. And he had that ability because he could say, okay, this is not what's required of me in this situation. As communication scholars, this was really exciting because this is something that we tried to get our communication majors to understand by the time they graduate. This is higher order communication skills that is important in the workplace, certainly, and also in just any relationship and community building. And the fact that this is something that student veterans learned in the military and brought in with them, regardless of their major, was a really exciting finding for us. This played into the other key findings of strength. So the ability to contextualize communication assisted students with the other strengths such as diversity, leadership, and drive. And I've just put one empirical example for each of these themes or strengths that student veterans mentioned, and I'll let everyone read those for themselves. But diversity was essentially across student vets interviews a strength that meant that they could work with anyone from anywhere. And this might be across countries or cultures, internationally, but also nationally. Just serving with diverse people in the military meant that the student veterans believed that they could care about, work with, and value the perspectives of people who didn't share where they grew up, who had different orientations around class, gender, race, culture, language. And this was a huge skill and strength that they believed that they brought to the university that they didn't always see in more traditional students. Another key strength was leadership. And this one, perhaps is not as surprising as at least I always had a perception that student veterans would have a lot of leadership skills. But one of the things that came out of our research was how they could use this skill to help other students and how they valued doing that. Student veterans often talked about their desire to be seen as an additional faculty member when they were working in other student-centered groups. So they could go into these groups, take a leadership role, mentor other students, help them figure out how to reach the goal, how to make a plan. And student veterans talked about this with a lot of pride. There was something they were proud of, this strength and this ability. And, as we look at our study overall, we see a lot of opportunity for faculty and staff and administrators on university campuses to really try and connect with our student veterans through their strengths. And finally, a strength that everyone mentioned was drive. And this was not only being able to accomplish a goal, which certainly all student veterans talked about, a desire to do and to stay focused and committed, as Kay mentioned in the survey data, but also just to be able to prioritize in order to reach a goal. As this quote says, as Rachel says, being able to recognize what's a glass ball and what's a rubber ball, like what's required of me now, what must I do to reach my goal? And sometimes that means looking at a context as a whole and making decisions around how to spend time or what to work on. I will turn it over now to Kay to talk about some of our findings and where we think we can go from here.
So both the survey and interview data that we collected indicate that student veterans have a lot of assets and rich experiences that they can draw on, and they can translate into academic success in higher education. And we think that it is very important to incorporate that in a lot of activities that we engage ourselves in on campus. So we would like to base our empirical data in advocating the strength-based support model. And as Katie mentioned in the beginning, it is not to dismiss the importance of discussing and building support and identifying challenges for student veterans on campus, but rather strengthening the narrative by having a more balanced approach to understanding student veterans in higher education. So in advocating strength-based model in a variety of efforts that we have in higher education, we offer specific strategies or recommendations with regard to how we can perhaps incorporate that strength-based model in our classroom and beyond. First of all, we can think about the ways in which we can harness student veterans' strengths in the classroom and also outside the classroom. As instructors, we can think about the ways in which we can call on student veterans' experiences directly, their leadership experiences, their exposure to diverse environment and working with individuals with diverse backgrounds, their enriched and broadened perspective about the world, and how we can incorporate that experiences and empowering student veterans in the classroom discussions, and also in group projects, enlisting them in leadership roles to be able to help and facilitate the student level learning processes that might be a really constructive way to harness student veterans' strengths in the classroom. And beyond the classroom, it is related to the second point, inviting student veterans to reflect on their strengths. Sometimes student veterans may already know and have a very clear idea about what their areas of strengths are, particularly given their military experiences. Sometimes they may lack in their ability to articulate that and making a very explicit and clear transition or translation between their experiences and their academic success. So perhaps staff in academic advising or veteran student centers in the universities may be able to encourage students and advise them to think more about the assets they were able to cultivate through their military experiences, and how those could be accentuated, elevated, and translated into their future career development or their decision on which academic discipline they want to major in or double major in, and things like that. Lastly, the strength-based model can be applied to our conversation at the macro level, at the institutional and also national level in our conversations. So as we said earlier, perhaps as a community, we might be able to develop more balanced narrative around student veterans, not only focusing on the challenges and support systems that we might be able to offer for student veterans, but also about how we can frame and talk about student veterans from the perspective of strengths and the assets that we can draw on from their experiences. So given the strength-based model that we are advocating, we're interested in pursuing our future research in a few areas, particularly with regard to measuring the impact of and implementing, first of all, and also measuring the impact of strength-based model in two specific areas. And we strongly invite the members of the community and the researchers and practitioners in this area to pay attention to these areas for future research. First of all, we think that strength-based model can be certainly incorporated into a variety of training programs for faculty and staff. And we started out in this presentation today with our personal experiences with how we perceived in terms of the narrative and framing around student veterans in our new faculty orientation program. And perhaps those training sessions or programs could be developed with the specific focus in mind toward the balanced narrative around it, not just skewed toward the support and deficit model, but more extra attention to thinking about the best way to bring out the strengths and assets that students can bring to the academic community. And then secondly, the strength-based model could be incorporated into developing university marketing efforts, and we can measure its impact on student veterans' sense of inclusion. When university marketing efforts and initiatives are developed around the narrative about the challenges supports only, that can be very different from the perspective of strength-based model, particularly given the fact that the materials can be designed so that student veterans, when they see marketing materials about a university or particular campus, they can see the material as a way to kind of recognize and be recognized in terms of their experiences as a military veteran. And they may feel empowered to be able to bring something to the university as opposed to framed as a population that needs support and also vulnerable population. So the change in perspective and also more balanced perspective toward the understanding and narrative around student veterans, particularly in the marketing development of the marketing initiatives, could have a huge impact on student veterans' sense of inclusion, and that may be really important avenue to consider as our future research. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we greatly appreciate this opportunity for us to share our research with a larger community beyond our university and beyond the Journal of Continuing Higher Education. And with that, we would like to open it up for any questions and comments.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Yoon. An awesome insight into the strengths about our student veterans. And now is such a wonderful time that we have this kind of conversation, especially since universities and higher education is kind of talking more about, diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice, that whole kind of, and our student veterans serve a wide range and come from a wide, diverse population as we talk about, social, economic, racial identity, all those things come play there. And it looks like we have a lot of questions coming in. So the first question that came in is, going with the context of this presentation, could you please describe how the difference between veteran friendly and veteran inclusive?
Yeah, Kay, please jump in if your recollection is different than mine. So keeping in mind that this is our understanding just based on the literature that we've read, and many of you might have a much better answer to this, but our understanding is that there is a specific designation of military friendly that a university can achieve. And this is often based on the types of supports that they offer around, sometimes it's things like having early enrollment or registration, having a student veterans office on campus, and having particular support systems or support staff involved. So it's more of an official designation that is given to an institution.
To go along to kind of answer that question, and many of the folks who represent student veteran centers, you're right, Dr. Sullivan, there are various, and it based, like you said, with student veteran centers, application waiving of application fees or tuition waivers, things of that all goes into play with that too, in terms of what is veteran inclusive versus veteran friendly. And I like the whole veteran inclusive language because we're talking about, not coming from a deficit model. But we have another question here that's in, it was talk more about your research in terms of the amount of students that you interviewed. How many students that you interviewed were undergraduate versus a graduate? Not sure if that was presented in the conversation.
That's a great question. They were all undergraduate students, just so happened that they were. It was open to any student veteran on campus, so certainly was open to graduate students, but everyone happened to be undergraduate.
Thank you. Next question that we have coming in here is, for veterans who do not wish to just disclose their veteran status, especially in the classroom, what are some ways that you can harness their strengths? Many times, some of our veterans are like, I'm just here to go to school, get my degree and get out. And, I served, but this is my identity now. So how can you harness their strengths in the classroom?
That's a great question. And it's something that Kate and I talked about a little bit. Yes, we want to find a way to harness their strengths in the classroom, but how do we do it without putting them on the spot, without considering their preferences, right? So I do agree that we shouldn't really force students to share their experiences unwillingly, and that would be the opposite of what we want to do in the classroom. And I think, we have to be really sensitive to student wishes and their identity negotiation processes. So I would personally think that I would want to develop relationships with individual students about what they're comfortable with, and particularly to learn about what they're comfortable with in the classroom. And some students are really active and vocal about their military experiences. They really want to kind of offer their expertise gained from the military experiences to their peer students in the classroom and to the faculty. So there's a difference and variance across student veterans in terms of their willingness and also their comfort level in revealing their military veterans status. So I would definitely be sensitive to that. And I think that it would be wrong to assume that everybody would be comfortable in talking about that in the classroom.
So just a reminder to those of you guys who are listening in and on this, make sure if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer sessions. We got questions coming in, which is awesome. So we have another question here. If there is not a veteran resource center on campus, what is the best way to serve student veterans, even if there is a small population? what is the best way to get the rest of the, and I guess it's a two-parter, and what is the best way to get the rest of the college community on board? So how is best serve veterans if you don't have a resource center, and how do you get the institutions on board?
That's a really great question, and that isn't something that I have put a great deal of thought in. So again, JJ, you might have some ideas to share about this as well. But one of the things that we learned in the interviews is that student veterans really appreciated the student veterans office,
Right.
but that what they really desired, particularly around their academic success, was strong relationships with their faculty. So I think even if you don't have a student veterans office, having some sort of training for faculty that allows them to understand the experiences of student veterans on your particular campus, and in particular, this strengths-based approach that is balanced alongside any sort of challenge-based conversation or support-based conversation, is a really good start. Because if your faculty are knowledgeable about student veterans and their strengths, then this can be something that filters through their personal relationships with the student veterans.
To kind of piggyback off what you were saying in terms of not having a resource camp, reach out to reaching out to your HR department and see who are those faculty and staff who are veterans, and kind of developing and asking them how to establish relationships are key. I think also veterans, coming from a dependent background, veterans just want you to be upfront and honest and engaging them. And so as upfront and honest as you can be, that's one way of serving our veteran student population, even if you don't have a resource on campus. Reaching out to your local VA clinic and seeing those resources, reaching out to see what resources are there for our veterans within your community is one way of serving our veteran students, even if there's a small population. The best way to get the college community on board, again, reach out to your veteran faculty and staff, reaching out to your veteran community service offices. The more support you get, the more the college community will see that this is something of value as well. And I'm sure many of folks who work with student veterans on their campuses who are on this chat probably have some suggestions as well. Also, real quick, Dr. Sullivan, there's a thing in here says, can you ask to stop sharing so participants can see everyone? Sorry, I needed to ask that there. There we go. And it looks like, let's see, I answered that question there. We have all these questions coming in, which is great, which means I need to stop talking. This question that we have on here is, did you find in your interviews that some veterans express frustration with the lack of structure provided by professors for some team projects?
Yes, 100% yes. That was also a theme that came out of the interviews. And, we used it as a way to tease out, with the student veterans, tell us what you would like in that situation. But yeah, it was a common frustration, not only in our interviews, but when Kay and I were in our new faculty orientation, this was brought up too, that it can be challenging to be a student veteran with all of these experiences, this worldliness, this professional experience, and to be in a group with an 18-year-old who might not have the same mindset around what an education means or project goals. Yeah, and that's really where this theme of geez, just let me take charge. Give me some ownership of this team and I'll get it going. I'll whip it into shape.
Right. That's one of the strengths that we have. You talk about communication, leadership, and then the drive. Usually the first one is that, okay, let's get this and divvy out the task and that checkpoints and check-ins with those. Another question, which I'm not sure if this was part of your survey or your interaction with our student vets, is in the group that you had, you mentioned the service affiliations, the Army, Navy. Did you differentiate between those that were enlisted or officer participation?
We didn't include that question in the survey, at least. I'm not sure, Katie, if you did with the interview participants, but in the survey, at least, we didn't have any differentiation between the two. And across the service affiliations, service types, we didn't have any difference across those groups.
And in the interviews we did ask, and it was quite varied, the majority of participants were still active.
Cool, thank you. Another question that's in here is, can you expand a little more on how we can share with staff on how to bring out and emphasize those strengths?
I mean, we can think of staff in higher education in different areas. I'm thinking about staff in student centers, staff in academic advising, staff in career services, or staff in counseling services, things like that. So it may depend on which area of the service that we can think of, but I think I briefly mentioned in my presentation in terms of academic advising and career services for student veterans, and explicitly inviting them to reflect on their strengths specifically and drawing on their specific military experiences to bring about those areas of strength, and then connecting them to what they like to do, their specialization, their expertise, the career path, possibly. I think those things can be done in academic and career advising, and those are some of the specific things that I could think of. I would love to hear about other suggestions or ideas about different area of service that staff members could do for this kinds of connection making for students.
Well, I think first and foremost, I mean, we go back to just asking them what their, like in your research says, their strengths, and, and kind of having those conversations to connect them to resources, like you said, career services, academic advising, and even student organizations within their institutions, I think would be very key, which leads into the next question that we have on here is, what can we do to get veteran populations more involved with university policies and the general student experiences? We talked earlier about, the rinse and repeat method, work, life, school, home, work, life, school. So what do you think from your research, do you think how we can get our student veterans engaged in the university?
I think this is such a good question, and it's something that Kay and I have thought a lot about from this inclusion lens. So how do we get student veterans to, both feel and be included on campus? And one of the things that came out in our interviews that won't be a surprise to anyone here is exactly as you said, JJ, student veterans are busy. They tend to be perhaps older than the traditional students. They might have families or jobs. And so a lot of what we heard was, hey, everything the university is doing here is fine, but like, I'm not going to hang out and like go to an event at night. I'm going home because that's where my life is. But I think in terms of like, how do we get them involved in university policies and kind of some of these more like, daytime activities, I think an invitation is crucial. And that's what came out in our research, that student veterans are very well aware of the strengths that they bring, that they have, what they're capable of, but they do not always feel as though there is an easy path to walk those into the university setting. So I think if we create that path and invite people, there will be reception.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's so crucial to have those student veteran centers and even those student veteran specific orientations where you can engage your student veterans and let them know that these are the events that are coming up and these are the things that how you can get involved. And I think many times with us within the university settings, we gear our programming and our events more towards that traditional undergrad experience, that 18, 19-year-old just getting out to, so kind of, like you said, the changing the conversation, how we interact with our student veterans and how we program to our student veterans is something, to add on to that too as well. Another question here, I don't think this was mentioned in your study, but did any of your students identify of having a disability, whether visible or non-visible?
In the survey study that we didn't ask that question. So I don't have data that speaks to that. I would assume that portion of the population or sample that we have for the survey study would have students who would identify themselves as a disability, but I don't have a record of that.
And it did come up in the interviews where students would talk about a disability classification, but it wasn't a strong enough phenomenon to kind of track it alongside the strengths.
Yes. Next question that we have here is, has your research been published, and would you be open to sharing instruments if someone wanted to conduct a similar study in their own location? I think, and I have the article beside me here, it's published in the Journal of Continuing Education, and I don't have in front of me which date in front of me, but it has been published. But to answer that question, would you be interested in sharing your instruments and conducting a similar study for those?
Absolutely. Our manuscript was published in September 2020. So I don't remember the issue number, volume number of the journal, but it was published last year in the Journal of Continuing Higher Education. Our published manuscript doesn't include entire scale or survey instruments that we used or interview protocol that Katie used for the interview study. But if you reach out to any of us, then we'd be happy to share our instruments with you so that you can conduct the study in your own location.
The next question was about sharing the demographics chart. Just for those of you guys who are watching, to answer that question for you, the recording of the presentation is going to be posted on the NACADA website. So you'll be able to view that there in the future after this webinar is over. So I wanted to make sure I answered that question for you as well. The next question that we have is, were any of your veteran students who participated in this research upset or not happy with their military service? And how did you find your research subjects?
The survey data didn't show any kind of sentiment toward the military services, because the survey instrument didn't really address that or ask any questions around that. In terms of how we recruited our study participants, for both survey and interview participants, we contacted the Student Veteran Center on our campus, and we kind of relied on their listserv to reach the student population on our campus. And it was voluntary participation from the students, and we shared our information about the survey and interview study.
Cool.
And dissatisfaction with the military didn't come up in the interviews as well. I was prepared for that. And you know, because we had worked with the Office of Student Veterans on our campus to provide resources if anyone should become, you know, upset or want to talk further just through talking about these things, but that was not salient.
A couple of questions here. Excuse me. In your study, did you notice any patterns from one agency to another in terms of their key strengths?
No, in the interviews that didn't track kind of across, you know, the only kind of distinguishing question that I asked specifically based on branch of the military was about an express value set. And that question was recommended to us by the director of our Office of Student Veterans, who said, you know, it might just be interesting to see, you know, who has this off the top of their head, or, you know, or if there are differences throughout. And, you know, striking to me, but it might not be striking to any of you, is that, you know, when you ask, like, is there like a code of honor or a value set, or like, you know, an expressed goal? I mean, people just would rattle it off. It was just very top of mind. And that was the only kind of distinguishing question that we asked. And as I analyzed the data, the themes were so strong across branches that nothing stood out as linked to one branch or the other.
Cool. Scrolling through here trying to get, because it looks like that we have less than 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure I get to everyone's question that we have. One question is, did you only collect data on veterans, which I assume you did? Did you get any information about military affiliated populations such as National Guard reserves or military dependents? And I think in a previous conversation that we had, that was something that you guys had indicated about future studies.
Yeah, yep, that's right. That wasn't part of this study, but we think it'd be interesting for future studies.
Did you, and this is a really good question, actually, did you witness any differences in engagement or participation when interacting with male versus female student veterans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say, as I'm, thinking about each interview, interviews with my male participants were significantly longer than interviews with my female participants. And the only reason that stood out to me is that typically when I do research, usually I study managers and professionals, it's the opposite. So that stood out to me as a difference.
Let's see here. Scrolling through here. What are some specific ways that career services can help veterans transition from military to civilian employment? Are there other than simply highlighting on their resume? That's actually a really good question. Did either want to comment on that?
I think, the three key strength areas that our empirical data reveals, abilities in leading others, abilities in being able to work with individuals with diverse backgrounds. I think those things are, and also being able to commit and work it through and persevere. I think those things are universally sought out for, I think, regardless of professions, regardless of job titles or occupations. So I think that can be very generically described as a fundamental key abilities for any job, any position, any profession, but also it can be specifically articulated for a particular title of the job. If you are being hired for a leadership position, then the resume can specifically speak to the leadership experience, particular leadership skills or projects or initiatives that these individuals, the student veterans, were able to accomplish while in the military service. So I think making those connections specific or general, I think it would be critical, and I think it can be done.
And to kind of add on to that, some of the things that I've seen other institutions do and what we have done at our institution is many employers want to hire veterans because of their soft skills. So having programs where where employers can engage with their student veterans and talk about how they can kind of curtail their resume, talk about salary negotiation, how to use their military experience and translate it into civilian speak, and even having those sort of like career fair or hiring fairs where it's specifically to veterans, I think is one way that you could do that, and other than just using the resume as a way of connecting with veterans. And it looks like we have time for one more question. And I was scrolling to kind of find a real good question for you. Not that everyone else's question is not important, but the last question here is, do you think there is a mental overload for student veterans in the amount of resources available to them? And then a follow-up to that is, do you think a reduced, more focused resource be more beneficial than having a more generalized resources?
That is a really good question, and one that I haven't put a great deal of thought into, but others would have really good ideas about this, I'm sure. What strikes me from the interviews, as you ask about overload, is that kind of multiple role that student veterans are already playing, parent, workers, students, active military person. So, yes, I think that being very conscientious about the types of support services and opportunities, and really making sure that it's hitting the notes that our student veterans want seem important when trying to connect with people who have very busy lives.
Awesome. Well, again, this is all that we could talk about this all day and night and answer questions. And there's a lot of awesome comments I'm seeing in the chat, in the question and answer as well. But again, I wanted to take this time to thank you for your time and your service in terms of this research. Again, this is all the time that we have questions for. Again, like I said, I wanted to thank Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Yoon for this awesome informational session. I'm sure we all learned a lot, generated new ideas on this. I also want to take the time and thank the Association for Continuing Higher Education, ACHE, for partnering with NACADA to sponsor this informational session. And at this time, I want to go ahead and hand it back over to Gary Cunningham for additional comments or remarks. Gary?
All right. As a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Army, I give a hooah. Good presentation, guys. Great. Now, I thank you all for attending, but I want to also give a quick reminder in the emails that went out about this event, there was a link to the online article that they were talking about during the presentation today. So if you'll look back through your inbox there, you'll find there was a link provided to you. The recording will go up on the website as soon as we can get it processed and uploaded. So look for it there and share it with everyone. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We thank our panelists and JJ for your moderation. Attendees, if you don't mind, we'd like to ask you now, if you would just reach up in that upper right-hand corner, click that little red X if you're on a Windows computer, up in the left-hand corner, the little red circle for a Mac, and just close that Zoom window for us, please. That'll give us just a moment to wrap things up with our panelists. Again, we thank you for your attendance and your attention, and we hope to see you in future NACADA and ACH events. We thank you all. So panelists, if you'll stand by just a moment, I'll be assisting moving people out of the Zoom room here. And it's a few clicks. So just kind of bear with me a moment if you don't mind.
No problem.